Hello and welcome to Eastern Roman History. Today I shall be ranking the Eastern Roman emperors from Constantine I till Constantine XI, going dynasty by dynasty. Joining me today is Mark, who shall be going with me through this journey through over 90 of Constantinople's emperors. Now, without further ado, let us begin.
Today we'll be discussing about 5 emperors. So, our first emperor is Constantine I. So, I think what we'll do is I will put where I think Constantine should go, and then you can tell me where you put him on your list, and then we can talk about why.
Yes.
Okay, so I'm going to put Constantine right at the top, and I think he is an exceptional emperor. And there's a few reasons for this. Well, one, there is a element of legacy. He's one of the emperors with the biggest legacy on events today. But just as an emperor himself, he was a very competent military commander, a very able political actor as well, and also he instituted an enormous number of reforms. He introduced the gold solidus, which would continue to be the preeminent currency of the denomination of currency in the empire for the next 700 years. He reformed the army to develop the committences, so you had the limitani on the frontiers, and you also had the committences in strategic locations within the empire, unlike Diocletian's system, which was just have all the troops on the frontiers. Although some ancient authors like Zosimus did criticize him for this, it did set up how the army worked for the next 3 centuries, so it's pretty good going. He resolved the tetrarchy, what turned into a bit of a mess. He established political stability. He established his own dynasty as the preeminent dynasty of the empire, which would continue to rule the empire for the next 40 years after he died. And he learned a lot from the tetrarchy, and so you have the division of the empire up into 4 with him as the head honcho. There are definitely lots of things to say against Constantine. He spent a lot of time fighting civil wars, but he was also very competent in foreign affairs, defeating the Franks and so on. But he executed his son Crispus in a very obscure set of circumstances, which, although we have some idea of what happened, I think there is an element of we'll never truly know why he executed Crispus. And also some of his reforms could be said to have detrimental effects, like the Chrysagoron, which was a tax on trade and merchants, which was deeply unpopular. However, I consider him to be an exceptional emperor. How about you, Mark?
I do concur. I have also put Constantine I as an exceptional emperor. You are right when it comes to legacy, mainly because we can feel his legacy to this day, perhaps more than any other Roman emperor. His victories in the civil wars are from, whilst he did plunge the empire into civil war through his actions at times, and not to mention you did mention his execution of his son, which the latter especially should serve as a black mark against him. I think that one also has to take into account, in addition to all the excellent reasons you've given, his attempt to avoid a split in the church by convening the Council of Nicaea, which I think shows that he recognised, perhaps more than any other higher up in the Roman administration at the time, the potential for damage a conflict amongst this ascendant religion of Christianity could cause.
I think that's a valid point.
Because you've got to think prior to this, would an emperor really have bothered themselves with such a matter?
Not with Christianity. Or any other religion, really.
Well, yeah, with any religion which isn't
The Roman one.
Yeah. So, I think that he actually had quite good foresight and quite good instincts in that regard.
I think, just to add something to that, I think Constantine was very astute at recognizing the church as a power, but also defining how the emperor and the rest of the empire relates to the Christian church. There's a famous, or maybe not famous, but there's by Constantine to him, basically stating that I am a Christian, I will always support the church, but I'm also an emperor, I'm also a Roman emperor, and as much as I will support the church, I cannot put you over the rest of the empire. And so it's a kind of this element of toleration of the church has the most preeminent space in the empire, but he is also a pagan emperor, he is also the emperor to the Jews and the Manichaeans of the empire, and so on. And this is a kind of battle that the emperors will have to face throughout the 4th century between the relationship of the emperor in regards to the church and the other religions of the empire.
Yes, the church is an interesting one, and it is curious that he waits. Given that he convened the Council of Nicaea, he does wait until his deathbed to be baptized, and of course he's baptized as an Arian, which is also perhaps it's very interesting, and it's something that I know historians have been struggling with ever since. I don't think one should necessarily see him being baptized as an Arian as a mark against him, but rather curiosity.
Yeah. It might help that he was baptized by the Arian bishop Eusebius of Byzantium, so that may have swayed him one way or the other. Anyway, let's move on to the first of his sons. So, Constantine II. How would you rank Constantine II?
I've put Constantine II as a bad emperor.
Ooh, bad emperor. I am going to be slightly more generous and just put him as incompetent.
Fair enough.
Would you like to explain why you think he's a bad emperor?
I think he's bad because he's part of the reason why there was if you ask me, his refusal to stick to any of the deals he made with his brothers basically is what led to some instability during the first years after Constantine's death in 337.
Yeah.
And whilst it didn't split the empire asunder or anything, the potential for it to have occurred simply because of his own greed makes me think that as an emperor he was not good, and it goes beyond mere incompetence in my view. So I think with incompetence you at least need to have a attempt at doing what you think is right, and Constantine did feel, but I think there is a huge amount of self-serving by Constantine II.
I think so. I do think there's an element of arrogance in that, being the eldest surviving son. He should have the most authority in the empire. It's interesting he never disputed Constantius's position, but perhaps sheer geography dictated that he couldn't.
Yes.
I think there is an element of we know so little about Constantine because he got a damnatio memoriae against him that in some ways it's difficult to tell. Much like Crispus, it's kind of we have the official version of what happened, but there's probably a lot behind that we'll never know. But just on the evidence of what we do know, he brought back the Bishop Anastasius, which, okay, fair enough. And he was killed in his own military campaign against his brother in an ambush, which he should have known better, really.
Indeed.
Okay, so let's go by seniority and talk about Constantius II. What do you think of Constantius II, Mark?
I have put him as a decent emperor.
Okay.
Yeah, perhaps I'm a bit generous or not generous enough. I'm sure you're going to tell me, but I put him as a decent emperor partly because he was able to defeat attempts at usurpation after the death of Constans.
Yeah.
And become sole ruler of the empire. I think that achievement in and of itself should not be underestimated. His pardoning of Vetranio, I think, it shows that there is not perhaps malice in him, which perhaps his brother had.
Which one?
Constantine II.
Yes.
Yeah, I can't see Constantine II pardoning Vetranio. But as I say, unfortunately, we don't know all that much about Constantine II, which is a bit, in comparison to others. So I think that the achievement of getting sole rule and seeing off attempts at usurpation should be respected. His defeating of the Alemanni militarily should also be a notch up for him, His attempts, his religious policy is a curious one. I'm not sure if his attempt at compromise was... you can see that you can see why it was perhaps a good thing to attempt to compromise, but his attempt to compromise ultimately failed in the Arian controversy.
Yeah.
And
I think eventually it just goes full Arian and starts persecuting Nicaeans and so on. And he's no friend to the pagans either.
Yes. The reason why I could not bring myself to put him any higher, despite that I think he had quite a good reign, is the whole Julian affair just prior to his death.
Non-civil war.
Yes, because as I say, I say a good thing about him is that he was able to. I don't think he would have seen off Julian had he lived. The fact that he did not see Julian, I think he did not realise that Julian was the potential for Julian to become a usurper against him quicker.
Yeah.
Because obviously I believe he was facing down the Sassanids at the time, was Constantius. So I think that he lacked some of the foresight of his father.
Okay.
Who was quite good at dealing with his rivals. And I think Julian became a rival, perhaps, when Constantius, I believe, recognised the danger too late. Ultimately, it didn't matter, but I think that one should consider that when establishing the goodness, perhaps, of Constantius II.
So there is a lot to be said against Constantius II. His economic policy was kind of spend more and make more money. He never tried to balance his budget. And when he did, it was just kind of nick everything from all of his enemies, pagans. His war against Persia was actually, I think, very successful in the fact that, although he didn't manage to drive off Shapur II, but Shapur II never actually got anywhere with his wars, and which went on for like 15 years, or for most of his reign at least. In fact, that's part of the reason why he took so long to actually face Julian in the end.
Yes.
His priority was dealing with the external threat, which is something to be said for him. I would put him the same, actually. I think he's a decent emperor. He was a good administrator, but I think also a very poor judge of character. His appointment of his cousin Gallus, Caesar Gallus, was a terrible idea because he turned out to be a tyrant.
Yes.
And Julian, I think, also a good choice, but I think misjudging how much of a ambitious person Julian actually was, and how much of a vendetta he had against Constantius, which may be partially because of the massacre of the princes, which was conducted by Constantius. So right at the beginning of his reign, just after Constantine the Great dies, Constantius leads a plot to massacre all of the male relatives of his family. So his cousin Dalmatius, his father, Constantius, who was a brother of Constantine, and so on. So that all that's left is Gallus and Julian, which is an understandable act, because he wants to make sure that Constantius, Constantine, and Constans are the only emperors. But a rather brutal way of doing it.
Yeah.
He loved sycophants and loved spending money on people that didn't really need to be. Easy to condone abuses like Paulus the Chain in Britain after the defeat of Magnentius. Just kind of ended up turning into a witch hunt, which Constantius condoned because it got him more money. But there's a lot to be said for him in that he continued Constantine's administrative reforms and kind of this process of developing the changes that had been initiated by Diocletian into the formation of how the late Roman Empire worked. He defeated every usurper that rose against him, and considering there were quite a few, there was Magnentius, Silvanus, Julian, Vetranio, Gallus, kind of. He managed to defeat all of them. He also defeated all of his external enemies. And by the end of his reign, the empire was severely weakened by civil war and all of these foreign wars, but it was still holding its ground, thanks in part to Constantius. And I think they're a kind of testimony to his duty as an empire is presented with his giving Julian the crown after he dies.
Yes.
Just completely nullified. He didn't give it to someone close to him. Oh yes, his relationship with his brothers. So after Constantine died, he spent a good 14 years ruling with Constans, and they never fell out. They always managed to come to a compromise, or he always conceded something to Constans to preserve civil peace, which I think a mark of a good diplomat. And speaking of Constans I, I'm also tempted to put him as decent, but yeah, I'm going to put Constans as a decent emperor as well. There is an element of we don't know quite as much about Constans as we do of Constantius. I think partially just because of the sources that survive to us. But from the record we do have, he was a active legislator who wanted to root out corruption, continue solidifying and developing the administrative system by Constantine and Diocletian. He was very successful in wars against Sarmatia. He defeated his brother Constantine successfully. He went to Britain, always a plus.
In the winter, he did a daring crossing of the Channel during the winter.
He rooted out corruption. He was a good commander, and his death wasn't because of a popular uprising or anything. It was a few determined officials wanting to get rid of him and seize power for themselves in the form of Magnentius.
Yes.
And actually, you can get a element of Constance's popularity, especially among the army, with the fact that Vetranio, in the area that he had been campaigning the most, in the Diocese of Illyricum, is the one that actually kind of counter-revolts against Magnentius. I think he is a decent emperor.
Yes.
Perhaps my mind would change if I investigated his reign more. There's probably a lot more detail to get into, but just on the face of it, he does come across as a very competent emperor. If not always a popular one.
I have also put him as a decent emperor. You know, really for the reasons you've really taken all of my justification for it. But you know, as I say, his crossing of the Channel into Britain, where he possibly defeated a incursion from the north, I think he was trying to govern his part of the empire, which, you know, as an emperor should. That, you know, in the face of there being so little about him, or at least not as much as we'd like about him, one can't really find much in the way to justify putting him further down. Yeah. I don't think.
And I don't think he got deposed, well, murdered, measure for being a bad emperor, because even very good emperors got deposed. And now, to the last Constantinian. I just find it ironic that the last Constantinian would be the last pagan, and the first Constantinian, well, second really, is the first Christian. Where would you put Julian?
I have put him as an incompetent emperor.
Have you?
Yes, perhaps controversially to your viewers, but I think that his misreading of the situation in Antioch particularly is an interesting oversight on his part. I mean, you know, don't get me wrong, he was a good prior to becoming emperor, he was a competent administrator and a competent general and governor in the West.
Yeah.
But then once he's emperor, he as I said, he misread the situation in Antioch, and if you read the account of it, it's I mean, obviously the surviving account we have is obviously going to be biased against him, but it's quite damning, and fortunately one has to base these judgments on on what we have. I also think that his campaign against Persia, you know, he did get to Ctesiphon, and I think that you know, that should be lauded. You know, getting to Ctesiphon is a good achievement against the Sassanids. Yeah. His failure to take it ultimately meant that he was then, had he taken Ctesiphon, he could have stabilised the East, and he would not have faced the disaster, because obviously if you don't take Ctesiphon, he had to retreat. He didn't take Ctesiphon, so he was then, unfortunately, his army was harassed all the way back, and eventually he himself was caught and killed. Died. Oh yes, killed even. I mean, not that I don't appreciate the boldness of such an invasion, but you know, if you're going to push for it, then you've got to push with the trying. You know, actually, you've got to take it. If he had have taken Ctesiphon, perhaps I'd even put him way up near the top just for that achievement alone.
Perhaps he would have lived.
Indeed, and it'd be, you know, I don't like to go too much about alternate history, but one would be curious to see what would have happened had he have lived, especially on the religious side of things. He's a hard one. He's a hard emperor to place, partly because Christian authors after his reign are very damning of him, of course, because he's remembered in history as Julian the Apostate.
Yes. Which is accurate, because he was a Christian and converted to paganism.
Well, indeed. But I mean, it isn't the only element of the man.
No.
Once he was emperor, and his misadventures in the East means that I would put him as an incompetent emperor.
Okay. Well, I have a bit more favourable opinion of Julian as senior emperor. I think I would count him as a good emperor.
Above Constans and Constantius II.
When you put it, we'll put him as decent. I think if I put him in good, I'd have to also put Constans I there. And I'd like to be more discerning, I think. But let me explain why. So, I do agree with you in that his handling of Antioch and kind of anti-pagan sentiments by Christians towards him was not very clever. His campaign against Persia ended in a complete disaster in the end.
But it was bold.
Losing his life. He did the classic thing of he burnt his bridges and then wished he hadn't. He also enacted some legislation which criticised at the time for being going too far, like banning Christian teachers and so on.
Yes.
Kind of doing the opposite of what his cousins had been doing. But there are a lot of other good things that he did, which I think show him as quite an astute ruler. He cleared out the court of Constantius II, which was full of hangers-on, sycophants, and kind of undesirables that weren't really useful. He also punished Paul the Chain, person in Britain, which, if I recall, was burned alive, so he got his comeuppance. His reform of paganism to try and compete with Christianity is very interesting. It does show an attempt to try and, by him, because he knew Christianity very well, an attempt to try and make paganism a religious competitor. Whether it would have worked after his death is also a good kind of what if, but he died, so...
Yes, his attempts at trying to codify paganism, I think, it was a bit of good judgment on his part.
Yeah, and also to try and divide the Christians, which were his avowed opposition, not by persecution, which a lot of 3rd century emperors like Decius and Valerian and Diocletian have failed at doing, by persecuting them, but by just letting their arguments tear themselves apart, by releasing all the Arians and Donatists, and also was a wise move on his part if he wanted to, or kind of replace Christianity as the preeminent religion with paganism again. And also he enacted a lot of reforms to give back a lot of the things that Constantius had been taking away from the pagans, like their temple land. He also tried to prop up local councils, magisterial councils, like the Decurions, and try and reverse the flight of the Curiales. But unfortunately, a lot of these things which are very kind of seem to have got to the heart of the matter, he wasn't able to follow through with because he died. And the author of his death was himself, really.
Yes.
And there's also a few things that show a mark of misjudging situations, so being very favourable to pagans purely because they were pagans, despite murdering people, and condoning the kind of violence that he himself was condoning against, or would have condoned against Constantius II. And also he was very superstitious, which even one of the big criticisms against him was he kept zealous sacrifice of animals, which was distasteful. I don't think it's a sign of perhaps a bad emperor, but I think if he had kept doing it, he could have shot himself in the foot in his attempt at pagan revival with the changes to paganism that had taken place since Constantine, which many pagans had kind of accepted and thought were good. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does, yes. I still think that his negatives outweigh his positives, but I do get your point of view on the matter.
But otherwise, I think he is a decent emperor. I would disagree with people who think he should be up here in the exceptional department, because he reigned for 18 months and ultimately most of the stuff he tried failed, or was changed immediately after he died. And there we are! That's the Constantinians. Except Constantius I, but no one ever talks about him. Anyway. Right, so, next time we'll be talking about Jovian and the Valentinian Dynasty. I hope you all enjoyed watching this. Be interested to hear your comments. And thank you very much, Mark, for joining in.
Thank you for having me.
And we'll see you all again soon.